a lot of times when we're making decisions, there's a more risky decision and a less risky decision, or one that's more inside of your comfort zone and one that's more outside of your comfort zone. And I think after that pivotal moment when I decided to just apply to jobs and it kind of just worked out, I I kind of just rearranged how I approach decisions and went for the decisions that were more outside of my comfort zone.
Welcome to How I Decided, a show where regular people share important decisions they've made so that we can learn from them in making our own life decisions.
Hey guys, Alex here. So today's episode is going to be a bit of a different one. In the past, I've had guests share one specific decision they made, and I was planning on doing the same with Charles, my guest for today, who reached out to me about wanting to do an episode about a month ago. Charles was telling me about all the different kinds of internships and jobs he's done before. He's actually done 12 during college in various fields like startups, software engineering, data analytics, being a professional piano player, school teacher, and marketing director. And I realized from listening to that there was something more interesting here that we could talk about. Rather than focus on one decision, I wanted to have a conversation about his many different smaller decisions to try out all sorts of internships and jobs, while also making the choice that he wasn't going to be boxed into just one field. I thought this episode could be a great opportunity to dive into what one should do if they have many different interests early on in their career, especially when higher education is pushing everyone towards specializing early. Out of all the internships you've tried so far, internships or jobs, what are some that have really stood out to you and are particularly memorable for you?
Probably the one that stands out to me the most was the time when I performed piano at a restaurant and this was when I was studying abroad in Italy during my junior year. So how this came about was it might have been the middle of semester, and I was wandering around on the streets one night, just kind of idling and like walking around Florence when I stumbled upon this restaurant, and inside of this restaurant was a public piano. And I'm a piano player, so when I saw this, and usually I wouldn't play, but there was some part of me that said, okay, like I feel like I kind of want to play on this piano right now. I'm not sure what it was, but I decided to go sit down and play. And I played for around 5 minutes, and after 5 minutes, the owner of the restaurant comes up to me, and I think he's about to kick me out. So I start to get up and leave, but he's like, wait, stop. You're hired. Come back next Wednesday. And this is quite a surprise to me because I just sat down to play the piano and I got hired out of it. So this was obviously like a very interesting experience for me. And it's also very different from everything else I've done before, just because it's a performing kind of thing. And previously I've just done teaching, I've done software engineering internships, I've done a bunch of other stuff. But performing piano is kind of way out left field for me. So it was super interesting.
And how is it for you, given that this was so different from everything else you've done, to kind of be willing to go out of your comfort zone? Because I think that's something that a lot of us struggle with, is this kind of opportunity comes about. But I don't know if I was in your situation, I would take something like that just because it's something that's, like you said, so different for me. So why did you go after something like this, especially if it's challenging, like you said, and very different?
Yeah. Honestly, I used to be an introvert, maybe like ever since I was a kid, up until maybe 14 or 15. But so like, which meant that like I like to keep time to myself. And at the same time, I also like to express myself in different ways. So sometimes in the classroom when we'd have a writing assignment and then we'd like share it to the class, it was maybe some people found it, difficult, but actually I quite enjoyed just sharing my work to everyone else. And so despite being an introvert, I've always been inclined to express myself or communicate myself to the surrounding environment. However, like when I was a kid, I was too shy to do this. But maybe there was a time when I was like maybe 14 or 15, and I was thinking about what to do during my sophomore summer. And I asked my mom, like, what should I do? And she's like, why not just apply to a couple of jobs and see how it goes? And usually I wouldn't really listen to her just because that's what moms say. But just for that first time in my life, I just listened to my mom and I decided, okay, I'll just apply to a couple of jobs and see how it goes. And I applied to a couple of jobs and I got my very first job reviewing ice cream. So I would go to different and go like look at the ice cream quality and the packaging and stuff. And it was super enjoyable. And what that kind of taught me was that, like a lot of times when we're making decisions, there is a more risky decision and a less risky decision, or one that's more inside of your comfort zone and one that's more outside of your comfort zone. And I think after that pivotal moment when I decided to just apply to jobs and it kind of just worked out. I I kind of just rearranged how I approach decisions and went for the decisions that were more outside of my comfort zone. So when I see a piano on the street now, I just, I'll just go play it just because why not? Or when I see an opportunity to volunteer to teach English at like some Italian high school, I'm just like, okay, sure, why not? And it's not that like it's not scary or that it's not difficult because it definitely is, but I've kind of recalibrated how I look at these things and I've prioritized learning and growing over feeling safe.
Oh man, I just really love hearing that because I can totally relate to this too because I'm pretty introverted and have always been. But it sounds like after you kind of had that first decision to apply for the job and it kind of worked out from there, you realize like, it's like not as bad as you thought. And it's like now all just about constantly pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. I think this is something really interesting I want to discuss more because I can also see myself as a person where I can come up with like a million reasons not to do something, honestly, then talk myself out of it. And it's this constant struggle of like, I know deep down that something might be really good for me and have these kind of benefits, but it feels scary to kind of approach at first. So would you say a lot of your internship or job choices kind of follow the same line of thinking where you're like, okay, like let's just go for it and see what happens?
Yeah, that's definitely how it feels. So, a lot of my decisions I've made, regardless of like what kind of thing it is, whether it's like going for an internship or going for some job, whether maybe it's traditional or non-traditional, or even like non-job related. Like recently I've decided to, or actually I'm running a marathon this Sunday. Yeah, so
Oh, wow.
this was just like something me and a friend decided on last October, and we were just like, yo, like what's something cool that we could do? And like what's the most crazy thing that we could do this semester together? And we're like, okay, run a marathon. Like lock it in. So I'm doing that this Sunday. I'm just naturally a person who is more interested in or have diverse interests. So it's very hard for me to just study one thing. For example, in college, I can't just study business. Like I have to study other stuff. For example, right now I'm majoring in business and computer science. I took a class on what really matters. I took a class in public speaking. I took a class in filmmaking and piano. And so I guess it's just like a personality thing that I find it hard to just do one thing and stick to that one thing. And so that's the first part. I'm kind of wired in a way that I enjoy doing new experiences over doing the same thing over and over again. And the second thing is like, because a lot of people, and I was this way before as well, like maybe you have diverse interests, maybe you like doing a lot of different things, but then the opportunity comes to you, and then you have to make that decision of whether or not to do it. And sometimes the opportunity comes to you based on your efforts. So maybe you apply to a couple of jobs and you get accepted. Maybe you like, take the step out and do things that you wouldn't normally do, like play on the piano and get a job offer out of that. Or it could just be something that comes out of randomly. Maybe a relative comes and asks you to teach their son SAT or something. And when that opportunity comes, you may or may not be prepared for it. But if you're prepared for it, then you have to decide, okay, should I or would I take this on or not? And this is the part where a lot of my decisions have been just based on this why not? Just why not take this on and see how it goes? And it's the reason why I've done this is it served me well so far. And so I'm just planning to continue on doing this.
Yeah, I really love hearing about that because the previous guest I had, my friend Ilan, who I've known him throughout NYU, and he also has someone who he can't just be studying one thing. He has so many diverse interests.
And I want to ask you, do you have a sort of thought process for how you're going to manage all of those interests? Because I know you said like certain opportunities you're generating yourself by applying places, other things are kind of coming at you. During your time in college and in high school, where you're thinking about how to maybe like scale up your commitment to one thing or another, like how are you thinking about balancing all these different things?
Yeah. So it seems like you're asking, there's so many things that I'm doing. How do I manage to do all of it, or how do I choose what to do, one over the other?
Yeah,
So,
specifically, I think one over the other, right? Because, for example, I'm starting this podcast, right? And I'm choosing to dedicate more time to it. It's something that's more recent for me. And
yeah.
maybe that will kind of have to like take away more time from my other thing, which is, I mean, I don't have another thing right now that I can provide an example of, but let's say like something that I was doing for longer, but then I don't feel like as excited about anymore. So, like, as that and as an example.
Yeah, this is a super interesting topic. For me, interestingly, I don't really view it as a trade-off between doing one productive thing or like, thing that's interesting and inspiring over another. I kind of view it more as trading off of doing something that's outside of my comfort zone and interesting and inspiring and just wasting my time watching social media and YouTube and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Because a lot of my day is just spent just browsing social media, browsing Instagram, browsing Reddit. And to me, I don't think I've ever not had enough time to do the things I want to if I actually set my mind to it. Because I could just, if I really wanted to do it, I could just cut my time on social media or time I waste just browsing YouTube. That being said, there are times in my life where things get very busy and I'm doing a lot of different interests. For example, when I was in Florence during junior year, I was doing this piano thing. I was teaching English at a local high school. I was playing volleyball with some local Italians at some random place. I was playing chess with like Italians as well. And like there's and balancing coursework on top of that and going hiking and camping with my friend, going rock climbing. So like a bunch of different stuff and recruiting for jobs. So definitely there's like times in my life where things get very hectic. And honestly, I think the first thing is that it'll just be a bit busier than normal. And then my days will be a bit more packed. And I might have to spend less time browsing social media or wasting time and more time doing that. The other aspect to it is I don't really focus all of my attention on everything at the same time. So even when I'm doing all of those things, my attention is really more focused on maybe two or three of them mainly at any given time. So during that period, I was very focused on the teaching gig and I was very focused on the piano. And so I would dedicate maybe, you know, 5 to 10 hours every week practicing piano, maybe another couple hours, actually performing. And then for the teaching one, I would spend around the same time and maybe a bit more just preparing the lesson plans and just thinking about what I could teach, creating the slides, creating the materials, everything like that. And so at any given time, I am spending a lot more time on some of those interests or activities and spending less time on others. And that might be doing them less or just not doing them at all. And over time, over the 4 years that I've been spending in college at NYU, you know, there might be a couple months where I'm focusing on teaching and piano. There might be a couple months where I'm focusing on the job search, or a couple months when I'm focusing on something else, maybe creating like some random programming, like a programming app or something. And so over the span of a couple of years, you could definitely go in depth on a lot of different things like I have. And at the same time, at any given time, you're only focusing on maybe two or three of them at once.
Got it. So what I take away from what you're saying is that, well, one, there's always time that you feel like you're kind of scrolling on social media or stuff that you could cut down on and use that time for those other things, but also that you're not simultaneously like firing on all cylinders at once. You're kind of focusing on a few things, and then as a couple months go by, and maybe something else. Something else that I'm really interested in getting into, and it's going to involve a little pushback, but I think it'll be fun, is that I remember when I came into Stern, you talk to like the upperclassmen all the time, kind of try to get their opinion on your career and stuff. And I remember just a lot of the conversations being like, you have to do, this internship first. Like, whatever. If I was interested in finance, so this your sophomore summer, and then do the banking junior summer, your junior summer, and then that'll set you up for your full-time job. So it sounded like it was something that was a very linear path, and almost like it was just like the way it had to be done, right? And I that contrasts that with kind of your quilt of different experiences, right? You've done so many different things. What are your thoughts, I guess, on those people that are approaching this kind of more structured path and maybe haven't had the diversity of experiences that you've had? And what are the benefits do you think of kind of your unique experiences versus theirs?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. I mean, clearly it's working somewhat because that's what everyone at Stern is doing. And I don't think that one path is better than the other. So, and maybe like you asked about the benefits of kind of pursuing a range of different options. So firstly, I'm just gonna make it clear that this kind of thing, like there's a lot of positive benefits to it that I'm about to talk about. And at the same time, it's also a result of me not knowing what I want to do in life. So it's kind of just my way of hedging and just being able to do everything before I get started. And that being said, there are benefits to diversifying and not just focusing on one specific thing for your entire 4 years in college or, afterwards as well. And where this idea comes from is from this book called Range. And in this book called Range, the author basically says that there's a couple ways of going about life in different situations. There's one way in which you specialize entirely on one thing, and there's another way where you kind of diversify at first. You do as much as possible, you learn as much as possible, and then you don't specialize until later on when you've kind of had a better sense of everything. And just to summarize, the author basically advocates for this doing a bit of everything approach before specializing. And the reason why is because the world, especially nowadays, it's so hectic and it's changing so often that if you only pigeonhole yourself into doing one specific thing, like maybe you decide, okay, I'm going to focus on investment banking. I'm going to do this for the entire 4 years in college. I'm going to do it after college. If you decide on this, I'm not saying it's bad or because it's clearly working for a lot of people. I'm just saying when the world is so volatile and changing, if you're specializing in one thing very early on, firstly, you might not be able to see other potential options that might be better suited for you, or you might enjoy more, or might make more sense for you from a location or financial perspective. And secondly, if you're just doing this one thing, and you don't have outside perspectives, then you could get very easily rooted inside the way of thinking. And there's this analogy that the author uses, which is digging parallel trenches. And so if you think about specializing, it's kind of like you're digging a trench, and then whereas everyone in different fields are digging their own trenches. But if you're digging your own trench, you'll never realize the insights from the other trenches that you could see if you were kind of going in all of the different fields.
It's funny you mentioned Range because I remember my sophomore year, a professor assigned just like an excerpt of that book for our class, and it was specifically about Van Gogh, kind of a similar story of how he was just didn't really know what he was doing until he finally came across being a painter. And I remember reading that, and it actually made me feel better about myself to say like it's okay that I didn't have like a set plan figured out, and it's okay to kind of explore stuff as long as it's interesting and exciting to you at the time. So I really love this idea of being okay with having a diverse set of experiences, because I think especially with the culture of the school that I went to and you're about to graduate from right now, is that their specialization is the only way to make yourself competitive for these kinds of roles. And then I can totally understand, because it's true to a certain extent, that if you want to kind of work at the best bank or consulting firm, it does require a lot of like specialized effort and attention and learning early on, especially because they recruit so early. But I think there's something really cool about this idea of having this diverse set of experiences. And specifically, I also want to know how you felt like it's really helped you. And I know we talked earlier a little bit on a separate call about transferable skills and how even things that seemingly might not be related help each other. I wonder if you have some examples of that you could share.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I read Range maybe 2 years ago, And it sounded interesting. And I really liked the idea because it kind of made me feel a bit better about just being able to do a bunch of different things and doing a bunch of different experiences. And it's going to somehow work out. And so it just kind of made me feel good. But I didn't really understand how much like different experiences can be transferable to other ones until this was also again when I was studying abroad in Florence. And there was two things I was doing which I felt transferred very well. The first thing was I was doing copywriting, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's basically creating marketing materials. Because back then I was also tutoring, I was working at a tutoring business. And so I was creating some marketing materials for them and learning how to do that. Second thing I was doing was teaching English at the local high school. Now, the very first session that I was teaching English in, it was terrible. And that's because I feel like I used some traditional methods of teaching. I was presenting a presentation, I was giving a lecture, I was telling them, okay, this is how it works. And it didn't work because all of the students there were, they're very boisterous and loud and like they couldn't focus. And like I was like, guys, listen to this thing. It's so important. But no one listened because, that's just how students are. And so afterwards, I was kind of down and I was thinking, okay, damn, what can I do to make this lesson better for the second time around? And at the same time, I was working on the copywriting and I was learning how effective copywriting works because the whole goal of copywriting is to get people's attention and keep it. And I thought, okay, what if there's some principles I could apply from copywriting to teaching English here? So basically, I changed the entire way I went about it. All of the presentations, it was structured instead of like a this, like first this, then this, then this, and this with no apparent link. It was, I started off with, okay, why is this important to you guys? Because if the lesson isn't important to the high schoolers, then like, why should they listen? So that's the very first most important thing that you have to get across. And I started with that, and there's a couple other techniques. Like, so I also made it gamified. I provided snacks to the winners of the game or whatever. And so I basically made it less about teaching from a traditional standpoint and more about just figuring out from first principles, based on my copywriting experience, what would best work for these students. And so the second session, I did all of that and it was perfect. Like all of them were like super engaged and I could tell it just went a lot better than the first lesson. And this is just really highlighted to me like, wow, like I didn't realize that doing just different things, just a bunch of different things could kind of help me somewhat.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great story. And it shows that having a diverse set of experience, it allows you to have a greater toolkit of skills. So I really love that. And one more thing I do want to cover is your full-time job and how you decided to pursue that, right? Because you now, all these internships and jobs that you did in Italy, you kind of approached it with this why not attitude. Is that the same philosophy that you had with your full-time role, or is that something that you wanted to be a little more deliberative about, or was it the same thing?
Yeah. I mean, I wish I could say it was the same just for the sake of consistency, but the fact is, yeah. So what I'm doing as a full-time job now is I got an offer as a business analyst at Capital One. So, all roads lead to Rome. After doing all of this diverse experiences, I'm back being a Sterney doing the traditional path after graduation. Yeah, so the way I went about this was like it was also like I approached it a bit more structured than I normally would, just because it feels like this is a lot more important than a side gig that you could do for a couple months. And I also had like a lot of pressure from my parents who, they're like, okay, it's either investment banking, consulting, or maybe going into law school if you're interested in that, or maybe becoming a doctor if you're interested in that. And so my choices were kind of limited to like those things that were the highest paying. And there wasn't a lot of room for, different diverse job applications. And so when I was applying to jobs, I kind of set that as my priority. And I applied to a bunch of consulting jobs and business analyst jobs. Because in my mind, I thought out of all of these jobs, I feel like consulting or a business analyst, it one, best suits what I've previously done. And two, I think it best situates me to do a range or it gives me more options in the future. Because consulting, like you do it for a couple of years and a bunch of people, like basically you get exposed to a bunch of different industries before you specialize in one particular industry afterwards. Or a business analyst, you can kind of go into tech role in the future or more business management related roles. And so I feel like applying to these roles was also my way of hedging and making sure I could just expand and do more diverse options in the future. And honestly, it was just, I saw it and I applied to these 20 roles or 20 to 30 roles in consulting and business analyst. This was the one role that I got in and I got the interview. And yeah, so I'm just doing this now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I think it's ideal for you that you've gotten the job that actually gives you the opportunity to go off in a lot of different directions, right? Because you, as someone who has a lot of diverse interests, now you're going to be exposed to something where you could take it many different directions after if you wanted. And I want to go back to your earlier point when you were answering the question about consistent in the decision making process, because I actually think it's perfectly okay that we don't have to be consistent because not everything that we decide on has the same stakes, right? And I think what you're kind of hinting at is that for the internships, it's kind of a lower stakes thing. It's like for 3 months, maybe even less, kind of just during the school year. But a job is something that you're going to have a slightly longer time commitment to, and that's kind of how I think about decision making now. Is like some decisions are supposed to be made fast, right? But like then there are things that it requires some thought and time. But I really like the word you use too, specifically like hedging. I'm taking like a lot of like finance classes in grad school now. We're talking about like hedging instruments or stuff, but I love it from a decision making perspective because it's a choice that you're making, like doing this job where it still leaves you with a lot of options. So it's not something that is completely locking you into something for a very long time.
I definitely think it's true that, you know, I would prefer to keep my options open as long as possible. And maybe, who knows, like it's a good thing, you know, to just be able to do different things and do and explore more before I decide on what I truly want. And on the flip side, I feel like I am somewhat afraid of sticking to one thing and committing to one thing just because I'm not sure. It just feels a bit scary to just commit to like one single industry because then you're always faced with, oh, what if I could do this thing or what if this other job was better? And at the same time, I feel like it's part of life and that decision is definitely going to come sooner or later. But when it comes, I'll figure out a way of dealing with it.
Yeah, and I think you'll be more than prepared for that. So thank you so much for coming on. And for context, Charles was the first person that I have on this show who reached out to me first. Everyone else I've known them from before, but Charles reached out about how I decided, and we had a couple conversations, and was really excited to have this conversation. So thank you so much for reaching out in the first place and for listening.
What I take away from my conversation with Charles is that there are clear benefits to diverse experiences, and you have very transferable skills and the potential to thrive in a changing world. And it definitely doesn't prevent you from securing a great full-time job at all. What I think is even more important about these diverse experiences that for Charles, doing these different things has really made him more open-minded and comfortable with getting outside his comfort zone. I found it really impressive to hear him describe how he's shifted his mindset to why not. Something that I think all of us would like to do more, but we don't do enough. It's allowed him to improve his skill set and also have these memorable experiences that he can take with him. And I suspect in the future, it's going to allow him to really jump on the right opportunities since he's so used to just saying, why not? Not all decision-making has to be deliberate and slow. Why not can be a great heuristic to choosing to do something that's low stakes and reversible. As always, thank you so much for listening, and let me know who I should have on next for How I Decided.